So if you're following the train of events, we went from issues of private property, we're moving into issues of the most private of property. Sounds pretty logical, right? Because private property that we've been talking about, and I get more into it, has been what we call possessions. But I mentioned at the right at the beginning, the primary possession that we own, as the Constitution reads, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So life, that is self, is the highest issue of private property. So that's why we're segueing into this. And you say, well, how does it fit with responsibility, self-sufficiency, defense, and forgiveness? Well, you can cogitate that because that's exactly what we're going to get into. Now, I'll remind you, this class, first of all, the purpose in this class is, number one, to give you the tools that have been used in history to know truth. So the three tools we've talked about, we use the scientific method, legal, historical method, and logic, are tools to know truth. So you've got the tools, and we've applied them. I've showed you how to apply them, and we'll continue to do that. So you know how to apply the tools to different issues in the world, or different types of issues. And finally, the intention of the class is to show you ways to discuss these subjects with others. So that, from a Christian standpoint, that means to be able to share your faith. But also, if you, and I should have written up the areas. Let's see, the areas. Can you remember them all?
Science. I got it.
Legal. Hey.
Legal.
Law or legal.
History.
History.
Culture.
Culture. Old Testament, New Testament, and harm. And you saw, there can be disagreements between different areas, different ways of looking at things, because is there different truths in different constructs or paradigms? Yeah, no kidding. So because there can be different truths, like for example, you can make a law to kill all the Jews or kill all the Lutherans or kill all the Christians or kill whoever you want. You can make laws to do anything you want, as we've seen. So that directly contradicts a whole lot of other paradigms, right? The trick is, if you know where you are standing, if you know the audience you're talking to, if you know the discussion that you're involved in, then you can avoid the pitfall, the great pitfall of doing what? Well, contradicting yourself or others contradicting themselves, because the problem is moving between paradigms. Once you're in the science paradigm, we've seen it, right? Can you really discuss issues of private property in the scientific paradigm? No. Which one did we use? Do you remember offhand? Which one did we start with to make our proof? History. We use history and culture to make the proof, and then we move to show how law supports or doesn't support it, right? So where you got to work. Because remember, anything can be in law. That's why I won't say that's true. I have really great friends that are lawyers. But if you ever wondered why it's so difficult to discuss issues with a lawyer, they know this. Anything can be true in law. And plus, they're really good at playing the devil's advocate. That's what they do, right, for a living.
They still get paid when they lose.
And they get paid when they lose. That's unfortunate, right? But in any case, if we know in what area we're arguing, what construct. I call them constructs because the word paradigm is kind of overused, but you can call them either. They're called, in classical logic calls these paradigms. In a modern sense, we call them constructs, which is okay too. It's just a different word for the same usage. But in any case, we know there is truth, right? There are truths. And those truths can be proven, right? And certain truths trump, don't they? They do, don't they? Certain truths really trump. Like, for example, let's see if I can think of one right offhand. Yes, a great cultural one. What causes colds?
going out without a hat.
Right? Culturally, people really think that, right? Your mother tells you don't get cold. Culturally, don't get your feet wet. But what really causes colds? A virus, right? So science trumps every time in the cases of scientific issues, right? And we saw what we can prove and what we can't prove. You know, in science, the scientific method you can use for repeatable things. For non-repeatable things, you have to use legal historical method. And then logic, you use for things that are not physically, that cannot be shown physically, do not exist in the physical world. And we've been through that. But in any case, let's segue this, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did the last time. I want to start with the Old Testament, New Testament construct. But I'm going to mention this first of all. We saw that private property was based in specifically the value of labor, right? Labor, the value of your labor. And we saw that labor related to capital, and that capital related to markets, and all in all the purpose of government, and we proved these things. The purpose of government was to protect that. Now let's move the other direction, because we went this way. The other direction is your labor. And how do you have your labor? What gives you the ability to have the labor? Your health, your body, right? Your mind. In the old days, it was whether you could dig a ditch. Today, the most important thing is your intellect, right? So ultimately, where does all your labor come from? Your life. Your life. And so, if you remember, we started, what's the first subject we started with when we started into this?
When does life begin?
Life issues. Yeah, about life. And isn't it funny that we've just come right back to it? On the other hand, you know, before we were talking about life, we were talking about life issues, for example, in science. You know, what can we prove as far as when does life begin, when does life end, those kind of things. Now we're kind of at the point of, okay, we have life. So what does that in itself connote? What can we prove about life? Let's just look at, before I go into the Old Testament, New Testament, let's look at some, let's ask some questions or try to answer some questions that are kind of inherent. I know that, and I mentioned this before, and no one likes this, but in this provable construct of labor and private property, what is your value?
What your labor can produce.
What your labor can produce. So, what is interesting about this, and remember this, you know, there's nothing wrong with knowing this, because this is a truth. This is a provable truth. Okay? The provable truth is that your value that I can prove is only the value of your labor. And ultimately that means what? What's in your pocket? Right? This isn't, you know, we get squishy about this. We don't like this. Right?
In that construct, but in another construct, God says we are all important. We are all in the construct of the Old and New Testament.
Good. I was hoping someone would note that. Because you see what matters here? What construct are you working in? Because, yeah, do you have a question?
Well, just one thing. You know, I think the value of your labor being capital may be our society, but there are many people who look at that and say the value of your labor may be not what you have in the bank, not the dollars that you collect from it, but it may be what the ultimate benefit of that is. You know, Mother Teresa did many things of great value, and she was highly respected.
And which construct was she working under?
Old and New Testament.
See, that's the point.
Okay.
These are finalities, these are truths. So no matter what a culture says, our culture happens to think that the value of labor and capital are very high. There are certain cultures that don't think they're very high. But it's not a provable measure. For example, can I prove the value of Mother Teresa's work? Can I prove it? I can't prove it. On the other hand, can I prove, for example, the value or worth of a scientist that creates something, a cancer cure? Yeah, yeah. And by the way, in our culture, how do you see the value of that person's value?
The lives that are saved.
Not so much that.
No, it's in what they're paid.
It's what they're paid. Yeah, exactly. See, this is what I'm trying to get at, is that in the scientific construct, ultimately, now in this, let's segue. Let's say we're in China. Where does the value of that person's labor who invents a cancer drug in China? How do they get paid?
Belongs to the government.
They don't get paid. So how many cancer cures are coming out of China? 0! How many cancer cures came out of Soviet Union? 0. Now, you can debate all day which system of government is a better system of government. But an absolute measure is, again, the value of the labor. And how much do you value the labor in a culture? I don't know what's beeping, but...
It's your camera.
no, it's not the camera.
Daycare.
Oh,
I understand when you get too far from the children, sometimes it beeps,
Oh.
no matter what.
no problem. I just don't know where it's coming from, though. It's not... I didn't know it was something dangerous, maybe we've got a fire going.
You're pushing my pacemaker too far.
Oh, yeah. But, it's really important to note that no matter what we want to believe, okay? Remember we had this discussion before about culture, because we'd really like to believe that certain things are true. But unless I can prove them true, they're not really true, right? They become matters of what? Opinion. Or, ethics. Ethics begins to get into issues of opinion. So, for example, an ethical question is, do you value Mother Teresa more highly than you value Donald Trump? See? You see? We just moved between the two constructs, right? You see that? Can we really make a value determination between the two? No, we can't. Not in truth. We can make an opinion-based statement, but we can't prove it. And that's what I want you to get, is that, for example, you might have a raging argument with somebody about who is better, Donald Trump or Mother Teresa. Or Madoff. Take your pick. But what does it matter? Because you can't prove either point. In other words, what would be better, this is kind of a segue, a little bit off topic, but it's okay.
Donald, just a
Yeah.
second. Your last statement, you can't prove other point. I thought you just said we could prove that Donald Trump has a higher value than Mother Teresa.
In this construct.
Okay.
But
didn't you say the science
History, it's probably historical. It's historical construct more than a scientific construct.
okay, so you just labeled it, it happened to fall into that.
Yeah, just happened to, I started on that side. But my point is simply this. This shows how when you're jumping between constructs, it's impossible to prove. I can prove a certain thing here, but it doesn't necessarily relate to this. And so if you want, just a point, if you know what you can and can't prove, then it makes it very easy to see what discussions you don't need to argue with people about, and where you really need to go with that discussion. You see? So in any case,
Because
that's
if
kind
a
of...
person doesn't value like your Old and New Testament construct, what's the point of discussing from that framework.
Bingo.
If you're gonna relate to them well, you need to go to where their construct is and see what you can do with that construct.
That's right.
Is that what you're trying to say?
That's what I'm, yeah, that is a great conclusion from the point. Because,
She said,
yeah, what she said is this: if there are many people who do not believe in New Testament, Old Testament construct, to them it's totally foreign. To them it's something that's completely, they are not going to ever discuss anything with you about those unless you can get to the point where they trust you and they believe that you're talking truth. So where do you need to start? In something that you can relate to them in truth. Okay? And if you start there, then you have a chance of eventually getting to a place where you can begin to work or talk with them. This is like, for example, Young Life, in a faith-based ministries where they win the trust of young people, for example, and then they can talk truth to them in a different type of construct, in a different thing. So, for example, they relate to them culturally, and that gives them the right to talk to them about New Testament, Old Testament kind of things. But until you give your credentials or get someone to believe your credentials in, for example, science, if they're a really science-minded person, or history, or culturally, or even in law, you see, you're not going to have much chance of winning a lot of people or even influencing them in another construct.
So if you were talking to an atheist about the creation of the world, you would start under science, maybe, and discuss in their world the creation of the world, and then ultimately maybe get to Old Testament.
Okay, here is a beautiful segue from that. This is one of my favorite subjects of segue because this works every time. I think I've mentioned it before. How did the universe begin according to science now? The Big Bang. Do you know what science said about the universe before the Big Bang theory came about? It was called eternal universe theory. In other words, the universe was always there. Therefore, there was no creation. If you have a Big Bang, what do you have?
Somebody did it.
A creation. If you have a Big Bang, you have to have what?
Beginning point.
You have to have a beginning, and that in Greek is called a telic cause. A telic cause. Nothing happens in science without a cause. A telic cause is a cause that causes the beginning or an end. Do you see what you have as a segue immediately?
In the beginning, there was.
I ask every atheist that I happen to converse with about this subject this question. All right, you believe science? Science says there's a Big Bang, then what's the telic cause? What is the beginning cause of the Big Bang?
Intelligent.
And boy, you wouldn't believe how much flopping goes around. Flipping and flopping this way and that way. Because, the scientist, Hawkins, believes that it was super intelligent beings. Okay, well, how's that? What's that super intelligent being? Remember, what do we do when we begin a logical argument? What's the first thing we do in logic? Definition. Well, what's the definition of a super intelligent being, creature, thing? I mean, is it omnipotent, omnipresent, omni-intelligent, omni? What's that? It's a God. So Hawkins believes in God or gods that created the universe because that's a telic cause. Now, Hawkins would never admit this. He's an atheist. But you see this? If you get anybody to discuss a telic cause with you, what do you immediately have a segue into? A discussion about God. About God or gods. Which immediately puts it in the spiritual aspect. And the minute you get into a spiritual thing, you're not going to learn anything about spiritual from law or from history. Well, you might. Legal historical method, right? So where would you want to go next? Remember in my classes, what I do in my classes when I teach about Old Testament and New Testament documents. The first thing I teach is the veracity of the documents, right? Because if you can prove the veracity of the documents, what's the next step?
You use them as a source.
You can use them as a source, which lets you go here. Do you see this? So I start with telecause of the universe, the Big Bang. I move to history, you know, the historical veracity of the text, which allows me to move there. You can get to there. But it might take weeks or months or years. It might take a lot of education on your part or help to them. But you're never going to get here without starting with this for that kind of minded person. A historically minded person, where do you think you want to start? They're easier. Legal historical method.
Can I throw out the one challenge I've had?
Yeah.
A discussion I've had with an atheist friend of mine is he discredits the truth of any historical document, you know, it's written by the victor and whatnot. How do we know that what's actually, even though it's got 100 copies over a billion years, how do we know any of that's true?
That, I've seen that before too. You know what? Remember, the very beginning and the reason for this class is because I told you, we have 3 tools to know truth. Scientific method, the legal historical method, and logic. For a person like that, you can approach them, but the point you have to get with them too is, then how do you know truth? You know, that becomes the point. Because if someone, and this is, by the way, if you ever ask yourself, why in the 20th century we teach the way we teach? Why do we teach the way we teach in the 20th century?
We're now the 21st.
I'm sorry, well, no, I'll put it back. Last century is when this started. That's my point, is going from the 19th century to the 20th century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, what changed?
Legal historical to scientific.
That's literally what happened, is the legal historical method, which is used by lawyers and used to put people in jail in a carts in the United States of America,
Was diminished.
was determined to be of less value. And logic also was determined to be of less value than the scientific method. And so people are not taught this for lots of reasons. Number one, if you taught this, what would you have to teach in every school in America?
New and Old Testament.
New and Old Testament. Because the New Testament is the most historically reliable documents in history. The reason you have a problem is because people are not taught. People are not taught the message of knowing truth. And by the way, there's a guy, and I wish I could remember his name. Every now and then I remember his name, and then I forget it intentionally. He's a Frenchman who has, and if you ever read his texts, you'll probably burn them because he was nuts. But he was a philosopher who argued that you can never know truth. And his ideas, although they were fractured and really incoherent, became the rallying cry for modern historical and modern teaching.
That sounds like a diabolic argument then.
What's that?
I said it sounds like a diabolic argument then.
Well, yeah.
If it's no point to it.
No point.
Fractured and no purpose.
Well, they have argued this all the time, that you can't know truth. But yet, we know you can know truth. If I couldn't know truth, how could airplanes fly? Or how could electricity flow through wires? Right? You have to be able to know truth. And likewise, in a legal historical method. Do you remember what you did yesterday? Sometimes. If you're not lying to your diary, you might have written in your diary, right? In your journal. I'm certain I can find out. Matter of fact, probably half the cameras tracing you. I could figure out what you were doing. But satellite image. Yeah, I can see you in your backyard. But the point is that legal historical method absolutely can prove truths. And we have to evaluate those truths. That's one of the things I like to do in my classes. So, yeah. But if you say you can't know truth, you have a serious problem. And you have to learn or figure out ways that you can know truth. Because for someone to say that you can't know truth is automatically what?
Contradicting themselves.
Yeah, well, it's illogical, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's illogical. Because if you can't know truth, then what's with that? Over, right? I mean, I love this kind of stuff. You know, in my opinion, these new thinkers, it's so easy to slam them down.
Now today, people say, well, that's your truth, but I have my own truth. I mean, you can't prove it. I don't know how they can say that.
Well, exactly, and what they have done, what have they done?
They're in the culture.
They've ignored.
No one taught them about logic, right? No one taught them about this. Because, yes, it's true that there are different truths based on a paradigm. We can see that, right? But yet, they think, and because, you know, what this is popular scientific or popular knowledge that has been accepted by the crowd and you know, usually disseminated by what? The media? Who are trained in what? Journalism?
Well, take the Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah.
I mean-
Crop circles, a Loch Ness Monster. Yeah.
You know, and we know that's a fake.
Yeah.
Because everybody, there's still people that believe that there's a Loch Ness Monster.
Well, remember the guy, well, in the Bigfoot too. A guy actually came out and admitted that he had been faking Bigfoot for years.
Yeah.
You know, and the Loch Ness Monster, the picture and all the stuff was done. It's a fakery, and the guy on his deathbed admitted to it. But yet, you know, there are books. The books would fill this room about the Loch Ness Monster, right? Talk about delusional.
So
See?
1,000 years from now, the legal historical is going to be really skewed.
Well, that depends. That's the reason that, you know, when you look at legal historical, what do you have to do?
Source.
The source. Yeah. You know, and look at who wrote it. Like, for example, if, you know, and I'll get on this next week because this will be a big issue next week. I'll talk about scientific stuff. But, you know, when you look at sourcing of stuff, I mean, if you're a doctor, if you're a doctor, do you just accept any paper from any source for information about how to do what you do?
That's what the internet's for.
Let me tell you something. You know, remember the autism mercury autism connection? I've looked at every peer-reviewed paper on that subject. I'll talk about this next week. Guess how many peer-reviewed papers there are on autism and mercury that attribute mercury to autism? How many? 0. Every paper that attributes mercury to autism is written by, do you know who? Lawyers. Lawyers for and if you look at the papers, it's really funny. I had a scientific friend, an engineer who had an autistic child, and was part of that case, and was trying to convince me. So she sent me copies of the papers. Guess who wrote the papers? They're lawyers, and guess what the data was? It was all anecdotal data.
But lawyers are right half the time.
Or less.
Well, they get paid all the time.
They get paid all the time.
Was the philosopher's name Rene Descartes?
No. He was a 20th century philosopher, French philosopher. It's not Descartes. And he's much later. But his works I've got a copy of one of his works in my library. But like I said, they're in Coche. If you can even read them, I don't think they're understandable in French. And in translation, they're even worse. Because he's really not
Coherent.
Philosophy in the modern era will blow you away because it's not very good. You know, after about, you know, Soren Kierkegaard and a few others who were really great philosophers, things kind of went downhill. But that's another issue. Let's talk about this. Let's see, I'm running out of time. Yeah.
I think I'm in pretty close agreement with your discussion of seeing things in the different paradigms and so forth. One place where I think I might disagree would be to place theories like the Big Bang or the eternal universe or anything like that under science, because I don't see them as scientific. They're not repeatable, they're not provable. So in what light would they be considered science? Only